Our speaker is Professor Alice Joubin, Professor of English, Women's, Gender and Sexuality Studies, Theater, International Affairs, and East Asian Languages and Literatures at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where she directs the Digital Humanities Institute, the inaugural recipient of the Bell Hooks Legacy Award. She held the Fulbright Distinguished Chair at Queen Mary University of London and the University of Warwick in the UK. In 2026, she received the Shakespeare Association of America's Barbara Harsden Award, as well as honorable mention for the Publix Award. She is editor-in-chief of the Pilgrim Encyclopedia of Global Shakespeare, general editor of the Shakespearean International Yearbook, and the editor of the Pilgrim book series of Global Shakespeares. As you can see, Professor Joubin is an influential and a powerful scholar in many, many fields, especially in Shakespeare studies. We just double-checked with Professor Joubin that she will give her talk in 25 minutes, and we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. So you may prepare your questions now. So now let's give a big hand to our speaker, Professor Joubin. Thank you.
Thank you, Miriam Lau and Anna Zhou, for inviting me to the Hong Kong International Shakespeare Conference at the Hong Kong Baptist University. My keynote lecture today addresses the utility of the concept of global Shakespeare. What exactly are the ends of global Shakespeare as a genre and as a field of study? Might the notion have outlived its usefulness as a theoretical concept? Given the failure of globalism on social and economic levels, have the political, educational, and arts institutions that promote Shakespeare as humanistic been co-opted by new forms of nationalism? In the 1990s, neoliberal policies encouraged unrestrained free trade among nations, leading to global modes of communication and distribution of goods. Cheaper and easier international travel made people realize that performing Shakespeare in many languages has been a cultural phenomenon for a long time. Some scholars argue that those policies supplanted local cultures and exploited cheap labor in developing countries. Economic neoliberalism gave rise to global Shakespeare as an artistic genre, a business concept, and a scholarly field. The World Shakespeare Congress was in fact held in Tokyo in 1991. Anglophone Shakespeare studies in the 1990s began to realize the importance of criticism and performance outside the English language. To study Shakespeare is no longer just about the meaning of the plays. We shifted from a text-centric approach to more ways of seeing and hearing Shakespeare. Political thinkers on both the left and right now reject the neoliberal policies. Some scholars question whether global Shakespeare was just another way of claiming the universality or make Shakespeare relevant after the Cold War. Susan Bennett critiques the instrumentalization of global Shakespeare to serve only Anglophone curricular needs. Can we justify inserting Shakespeare into global social circumstances? Is it just another way of highlighting Anglophone values? Let me explain the problem. Epistemic injustice is a challenge faced by global Shakespeare. This is injustice related to the creation and circulation of knowledge about a subject. Coined by Miranda Fricker in 1999, epistemic injustice is social injustice that is induced by uneven knowledge. It resulted from the erasure or distortion of certain viewpoints, uneven valuation or deferral to authority, unwarranted trust or distrust, and undermining some messages in communication practices. So there are two types of injustice: testimonial injustice versus hermeneutical injustice. The first, testimonial injustice, occurs when one's voice is silenced or discredited due to various biases. The second, hermeneutical injustice, results from the misunderstanding of someone's experience due to lack of interpretive resources. Cultures that have historically been excluded may become unintelligible. This is especially true of subjects that do not fit established categories. The field of global Shakespeare has not sustained substantive diversity because research has been deployed to enhance diversity quotas in scholarship and curriculum, primarily in the UK, US, and Canada. Sandra Young and Chris Thurman questions whether a global Shakespeare has been complicit in forms of cultural appropriation derived from a colonialist playbook, positioning a range of elsewheres as exotic distractions. This tendency is reflected in habitual juxtapositions of global Shakespeare with Anglophone Shakespeare, as well as in the editorial practices that ask scholars of color and those working on marginalized topics to explain subjects that do not fit within the Anglophone world views. Amrita Sen has critiqued the uneven expectations of scholarly labor, where no footnote is required for Aristotle's Poetics, but detailed and potentially distracting explanations are required for every single thing that is indigenous. This phenomenon is known as the dreadful explanatory comma. Basically, explanatory comma is when you pause to explain something before continuing. When explanatory comma serves only white audiences, it becomes problematic, such as explaining a cultural reference to racial minorities. Come to think of it, Aristotle may be better off with explanatory notes. We would do well to explain the transmission of Aristotelian misogyny into English culture through a translation of an Arabic treatise. As Bernadette Andrea's work has shown, analysis white Shakespeare would be more on point by situating it not as a yardstick, but as part of globalization. Due to the current structure of academia and hierarchies of cultural prestige, some scholars of white Anglophone theaters regard knowledge of, for example, Asian directors as exclusively the responsibility of those who specialize in the subfield, then relegate that knowledge to a footnote of Anglo-European critical theories. These often inherited norms have predetermined what is worthy of scholarly interest in cross-cultural contexts. Maeve McLuhan has a term for it, structural conditioning. Basically, structural conditioning describes the action of previous generations that constrained agents in the present by having created the structural conditions in which they can act. We can counter this. The first step is to consider English language performances as part of global Shakespeare. We can also use more diverse theoretical models, not to mention there are global Englishes, including versions spoken in locations such as Hong Kong. We can draw on, for example, the Brazilian theory of cultural anthropophagy and present case studies without bracketing global performances as oppositional to white productions. There is a bias that privileges only regions that are commonly imagined to represent the global. In my new book, Contemporary Readings in Global Performances of Shakespeare, we present Anglophone, British, and Canadian performance histories as integral parts of global Shakespeare. I put Anglophone Shakespeare on equal footing with non-Anglophone performances in order to deconstruct these tendencies of national profiling. The action of national profiling falsely assumes each performance tradition exists in silos. My new book demonstrates the commonality and synergy between Anglophone and non-Anglophone productions. Traditional approaches tend to assume that performances in the US and UK are normative and aesthetically universal, whereas Shakespeare elsewhere bears location-specific, maybe political meanings, and the global is often erroneously imagined to be whatever US and UK are not. In fact, in Anglophone cultures, directors use different accents, hybrid performance styles, and multi-ethnic casts to amplify the idea that Shakespeare is a cultural other, something that is both familiar and exotic, and by implication, worth seeing again. In 2015, Terra Arts produced Macbeth that was set in a migrant Asian family. British Kenyan director Jatinder Verma uses the term English to challenge the dominant conventions of the English stage. In 2016, Oregon Shakespeare Festival came up with Winter's Tales, directed by Desdemona Chiang, and this is with an Asian American cast. The romance was set in pre-modern China and America's Old West, combining both Asian and Asian American perspective. This production presented the scene of exit pursued by a bear very creatively. Upon arriving in Bohemia, Antigonus encounters what appears to be a large brown rock center stage. A series of lightning flashes shows, however, the face of a bear, followed by its claws and eventually its whole body. So the rock comes to life, turns around, and reveals itself to be a bear in the form of a Japanese bunraku-style puppet. One puppeteer can be seen driving the bear's head, while two others are in charge of each of the bear's front limbs. The bear devours Antigonus, who, quote, exits through its mouth. We now need methods to theorize performances of Shakespeare. We need to transcend geopolitics to analyze diverse and polyphonic voices around the world with an eye toward equity and social justice. Now, if we think of global Shakespeare not as a destination, but as a journey, we will be able to gain new insights. Instead of questions of provenance, the idea of kind of where people or characters come from or which country they represent, I look at artists' stories of arrival, namely how and why and with whom they arrive here. Their journeys are more intellectually rich and artistically interesting. So I would like to offer a methodology to do exactly this, and that is called Heterotopia. This is a new method for the study of adaptations of Shakespeare. Heterotopia is a type of space, social space, artistic space, that evokes other cultural spaces. Heterotopia, created by the craft of world-making, can enable some characters' transformative experiences and self-discovery. This is a term first used by Michel Foucault in his lecture on architecture in 1967. He mentioned it again in The Order of Things in 1971. The term heterotopia refers to cultural spaces that are transformative because of their contradictory or transhistorical ideologies. Foucault made a connected argument about utopia and regulatory mechanisms of prison. Here I am focusing primarily on heterotopia as a set of parallel spaces. While the initial context of the notion of heterotopia was architecture and urban design, it is a useful concept to help us understand otherness. Foucault uses the mirror as a metaphor here to explain how heterotopia works. So if you think of a series of mirrors as gateways, you might envision something like this illustration here. Specifically, Foucault says that the heterotopia has the power to juxtapose in a single real place, like a theater stage, several spaces, several emplacements that are in themselves incompatible. So the theater brings into the rectangle of the stage a whole series of places that are alien to one another. He says that the mirror is a placeless place. In the mirror, we can see ourselves there, but we are not actually there. It is an unreal space that, quote, virtually opens up behind the surface. Heterotopia is a type of technology of representation. And the stage and the screen, they project and filter location-specific knowledge of otherness. In short, heterotopia makes the plausible believable in drama. The portal reminds audiences of their absence in the worlds of Hamlet or of Macbeth. Audiences are on one side of the dramatic mirror, seeing shadows of themselves by virtue of their vantage point and not being on the other side of the mirror. Like the Foucauldian mirror, performance functions as a heterotopia, making the place that audiences occupy both distinct from the dramatic space and connected to other worlds within the performance. there are several types of heterotopia being listed by Foucault. I'm going to name just a few, namely heterotopia of crisis, of deviation, of juxtaposition, and so on. Let me briefly explain each, and I'm going to use A Midsummer Night's Dream as case study for each. First, there is heterotopia of crisis, which is a privileged, sacred, or forbidden space for individuals in a state of crisis, such as adolescence or pregnancy. In A Midsummer Night's Dream, Duke Theseus threatens Hermia with the possibility of becoming a nun, being executed, or obeying her father and marry Demetrius. Diana's temple would be a crisis heterotopia. Number 2, deviation. Heterotopia of deviation is where individuals who deviate from the means or required norms would reside, and an example would be prison or retirement home. Hermia and Lysander, they flee to the forest as a deviation heterotopia, at least initially they assume so. And this deviation heterotopia is located outside the Athenian court, right, outside the normative society. Number 3, we have juxtapositional heterotopias, and this is exemplified by theater, cinema, and Persian gardens. This is Foucault's example, which will contain 4 corners of the world. Adaptations often evoke several spaces and norms at once. Following this, we also have festive heterotopia, fairgrounds, or the empty space that is the stage. These are examples that come to mind. Fairgrounds are often located at the outskirts of cities. Within A Midsummer Night's Dream, the mechanicals, temporally circumscribed play within a play, creates festive heterotopia within the fabula of Shakespeare's comedy. Last but not least, there is also illusory heterotopia, which is a space of illusion that exposes all real space, all the emplacements in the interior of which human life is enclosed and partitioned. An example would be brothels. Now, in A Midsummer Night's Dream, both Titania and Bottom enter an illusory heterotopia when Bottom is transformed into an ass, and when Titania is tricked into falling in love with him. Neither are quite themselves. So these types of heterotopia inform not only the setup of social spaces within A Midsummer Night's Dream, but also the construction of transformative spaces in adaptations. Now, suffice to say, place provides an anchor for dramatic actions. All plays exist simultaneously in several dramaturgically constructed localities, including where the story is set, namely where the characters live, where it is performed. Some theater venues may have symbolic significance, and the locales associated with actors' offstage journeys to where they are today. And of course, if a production goes on tour, it is equally important. So attending to the significance of place enables closer examination of the question of belonging and otherness. So I'm going to now put the theory of heterotopia to work by looking more closely at a version of A Midsummer Night's Dream. It is the BBC made-for-television film in 2016. David Kerr's A Midsummer Night's Dream is set in a nightmarish space of a fascist regime, enhanced with digital surveillance technologies. Actors and their characters orient themselves in the magical woods, which is a dream space where some social impositions are lifted while others are imposed. Meanwhile, film audiences go through a parallel process as they imagine social spaces that extend beyond the screen, as suggested by the movie's world making. The film is set in both a somewhat contemporaneous technocracy for the Athenian scenes and a Harry Potter-esque high fantasy world for the forest scenes, with references to the Silence of the Lambs. The cinematic spaces situate the dramatic action in a nowhere that could be everywhere. The film sets are best described as a heterotopic hodgepodge of disparate places, genres, and times. Kerr's film is reminiscent of other adaptations that use military uniforms to depict authoritarianism, notably Richard Loncraine's 1995 film Richard III, which is explicitly set in an alternative 1930s England. However, Kerr's set and costume designs steer audiences away from any film periodization. The architecture and color scheme of the emblem and Theseus' uniform may evoke the Third Reich, but the prevalence of touchscreens and mobile devices suggests a different era of surveillance and digital culture. The emblem of the big A of the Athenian court is a spin-off of those of the Avengers or Fantastic Four, teams of superheroes in the Marvel Universe. The guards carry themselves robotically and wear black helmets with opaque black visors that cover their eyes and show only their mouths and chins. They look like stormtroopers in Star Wars. The opening space evokes a military court and a psychiatric institution. The film seems to be saying that these two spaces are actually two sides of the same coin. Upon Theseus' command, "Now, fair Hippolyta," mysterious metallic creaking is heard. All the characters at this point, they act confused. Theseus has a smirk. Shots of uneasy faces, then cut to a low-angle close-up shot of a pair of wheels moving forward before transitioning to a medium sideways shot of the lower half of a hand truck. Hippolyta is being wheeled in as a prisoner of war and a trophy wife. Her white straight jacket, orange pants, and white restrained muzzle mask resemble those of Dr. Hannibal Lecter when he's wheeled out on a hand truck to meet Senator Ruth Martin in The Silence of the Lambs. Both characters' masks cover their noses and have steel bars over their mouths. In Kerr's film, Hippolyta's mask is temporarily removed for her to read aloud from a screen her prescribed vow about having the moon behold the night of our solemnities. In The Silence of the Lamb, the senator offers an affidavit for Dr. Lecter to read, which guarantees his new rights in exchange for helping the authorities investigate the serial killer who remains at large. Both scenes are transactional, and neither Hippolyta nor Dr. Lecter has real choices. Hippolyta only has 31 lines in Shakespeare, but she has a striking and outsized presence in the film. She is in a straitjacket in both the opening and closing sequences. In under 1 minute, the film's opening sequence thus establishes and juxtaposes multiple heterotopic and even preposterous spaces. Despite the prevalent use of electronic devices, there are no lights in Theseus' court. Instead, there are multiple fire torches in sconces on the wall to provide illumination. These are spatial, temporal, heterotopic design elements that, even without Brechtian acting methods, can draw attention to meta-theater through discontinuity. It is a valuable heterotopic experience to follow an adaptation where one is not compelled to identify Shakespearean allusions, but instead the rich references to other space-time instances, other films, other genres, and what has come before in terms of adaptations and afterlife of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Heterotopia pushes back against the illusion of Shakespeare's ubiquity or universal meanings by pluralizing the artistic and political positions across and within different communities. Characters who are betwixt and between worlds and allegiances, they would gain new arcs in Heterotopia. And some of these examples, as you can see here, would include Cleopatra from Antony and Cleopatra, Viola and Cesario from Twelfth Night, Edmund the Bastard in King Lear, and the Changeling in A Midsummer Night's Dream. All of them, when interpreted as mixed race or queer, for example, would have new character arcs. Gender roles in Romeo and Juliet and Hamlet are reinvented to tone down misogyny or perhaps to propose feminist reinterpretations, such as Mamoru Hoshi's University of Laughs 2004, Jongmin An's Fantasy of the Girls 2016, or Karen Main's Rosalind 2012 and Claire McCarthy's film Ophelia 2018. The idea of heterotopia as parallel and overlapping worlds highlights the inherent diversity of global performances. Artists often disagree on the meaning of Shakespeare's plays. What they do have in common is their effort to plant new ideas along well-trodden paths and to blaze new trails through long-abandoned territories. Performance styles borrowed from other cultures can help retool some place for artistic innovation or socially reparative purposes. The heterotopias of intercultural theater and film not only create channels between geographic spaces, but also connect different time periods. So, to quote novelist Minari Mizumura, if we walk through the doors of other languages and cultural spaces more often, we will be blessed with undreamed of landscapes and a more inclusive vision. Heterotopia as method helps us understand rather than flatten cultural otherness and the dynamic interplay between cultures. Thank you all for your generous attention. Attention is a real gift. I am looking forward to our discussion. Thank you for attending my keynote session.